Hi. In this short film, we will be looking at the seasoning and the kiln drying of our Scottish grown hardwoods and also one or two softwoods. This is an educational video done by Ashes, that's the Association of Scottish Hardwood Sawmillers. It is supported by Scottish Forestry, and we are filming it in the Scottish Wood Yard in Fife. My name is Jim Burley. Scotland can and does grow a wide range of impressive and beautiful broadleaf trees, which can go on to produce stunning and high-quality hardwood boards and timber. Most of the hardwood timber supplied by Ashes members, that is the Association of Scottish Hardwood Sawmillers, goes on to be made into things like furniture or fittings and kitchens and flooring and so on. All of this within a centrally heated building. This means the timber must be properly seasoned and dried before it is worked into these products. Otherwise, the wood will shrink and distort and develop cracks. This video looks at how we at Scottish Wood go about this process of seasoning and kiln drying our homegrown hardwoods. And what we do here is similar to how most of us in Ashes season our timber, but with some variations. For those interested in finding out more on this subject, Ashes have produced several very helpful booklets, and one of these covers the seasoning of homegrown hardwoods. These are all available as either booklets or online through the Ashes website. For the seasoning process in this film, we are referring to both the drying of timber naturally outside, or air drying, and to the drying of timber in a heated kiln, kiln drying. Most Ashes members do a combination of the two. We start off with air drying and then finish the process in a kiln. Air drying involves stacking the timber in layers with sticks or stickers in between each layer, and this allows the airflow to move around all the surfaces of the board, taking away the moisture as it is gradually released by the timber. At Scottish Wood, we have a mantra: to air dry, and air dry. Air dry is a wonderful way to season wood. For a start, it is free, taking the moisture down from perhaps as much as 60% water within the timber, down to more like 20%. No heating required, no fans for air movement, and so on. It's a slow process, but it is gentle on the wood, because wood reacts as it loses all this moisture. If you like, imagine a flat, wet and thin slice of fresh potato, and then compare that with the dry, cooked crisp, shrunken, curled and probably fractured. Allowing the wood to cure and dry slowly, keeping it flat and weighted, allows it to gradually lose its moisture, along with all its internal tensions, while maintaining its integral shape. Then comes the kilning process. Kilning force dries the wood down to usually around 10 to 12%. This is required because it approximately matches the relative humidity of the inside of a centrally heated space. Before central heating was widespread, well air-dried timber was generally dry enough to go in the inside of buildings, and a good place to see examples of this is inside old churches when central heating has later been introduced, and the centuries-old woodwork and furniture show the signs of further drying and shrinking. Kilning requires an insulated building, heat and air movement. At Scottish Wood, we work with what's known as heat and vent kilns, which is what we'll look at for this short film. This is the most common type of kiln used among Ashes members. However, we also use a range of other kiln types, such as dehumidifying kilns, solar kilns and vacuum kilns. With a heat and vent kiln system, we add heat to the building, up to 60 degrees towards the end of the drying cycle. And this heat is circulated around and through the stack of timber using fans. This warm and dry air heats the timber and encourages it to release its moisture, and it turns that warm and dry air into warm and wet and steamy air. And this wet and steamy air is then vented back outside and into the atmosphere. So if you like, you're sucking in dry air and expelling wet air. But it's an expensive process because you must keep adding a lot of heat into the chamber to replace the heat that is being constantly vented. It also requires several powerful fans to maintain a strong circulation of air around and through the stack. And this is happening all day and night. And so a load of 25mm oak, for example, may require this to go on for 3 weeks before it is properly dry. Thankfully, at Scottish Wood, all this heat energy comes from our waste wood and sawdust. But still, this must be handled, and the waste wood must be prepared and then ground up before it can be delivered into our biomass furnace, a labour and machinery intensive operation. Dehumidification kilns use less heat but require the timber to remain in the chamber for considerably longer than the heat and vent system. Solar kilns generate their own heat, which is great, but again, the timber will generally take longer to dry. And vacuum kilns are quick to dry timber, but require power to create the vacuum and also require an expensive pressure vessel to contain the timber charge. And to understand the seasoning process, it is useful perhaps to know something about the science of seasoning.
Hi, my name's Doug, and I'm going to take you through some of this science. Timber is made up of long cells, which I'll represent with these straws. The cells are surrounded by lignocellular cell walls, which are represented with this kitchen paper. These cells change in size throughout the year. They shrink in the winter and hold less moisture, and expand again in the summer with the increased flow in sap. These changes is what creates the annular growth rings in timber, which in turn creates the wood grain on the face of your timber boards. In a freshly felled log, these cells are filled with water called free water. This is relatively easy to remove. Once it's been removed, the water that remains is called bound water, and it's attached to the cell walls. This is much more difficult to remove. Good air drying in Scotland will remove all of the free water until you reach what's called the fibre saturation point, or the FSB. In most species, this is around 25 to 30% moisture content. Well air dried timber will also remove a little bit of the bound water. Now remember, wood movement and shrinkage only starts to happen once the FSB has been met, and so it will only begin to move when you're removing the bound water. Now back to Jim, and he's going to explain some more tips about how to season your timber effectively.
Okay, before starting the seasoning process, there are a few tips and rules to be aware of. Number 1. Different species of hardwood dry at different rates. Oak is particularly slow to dry, they say an inch a year, which means a 2-inch thick board, or 50mm, will take 2 years to properly air dry. Other commonly homegrown hardwoods, such as beech, ash, sycamore and elm, all less dense timbers, will dry more quickly. Board thickness has an effect. For example, a 50mm board will take twice as long to dry as a 25mm board. And where the board comes from in the log has an influence. A quarter sawn board, that is a board from the centre of the log, will take longer to dry than a crown board from the top or bottom of the log. But at the same time, it will be more stable during that drying process than the crown board, which will be more prone to cupping if not well weighted. 2. Place your air drying pallets onto flat ground or level bearers, as wood is flexible when it is fresh and wet, but becomes more rigid as it loses its moisture, and it will reflect any ground undulation in its shape. And for the same reason, keep your bearers and your stickers vertical above each other to give uniform vertical support. These air drying pallets, or we call them trays, are best orientated east-west if you can, rather than north-south, as this will reduce end cracking when exposed to the heat of the sun. End cracking is caused by the moisture being released more quickly through the end grain of a board, rather than more slowly from the sides and the faces of a board. And this results in over-fast drying at the immediate ends of the boards, which leads to the shrinking and cracking. Painting these board ends will slow this moisture release and reduce cracking. Some ashes members air dry under cover if they have the appropriate buildings. Others put caps or lids onto the top of the stacks to avoid the top layers being degraded from weather exposure. Weight can also be placed on the stack tops to keep those top layers flatter and more uniform. 3. You can mix species in a batch for the kiln, but always set the drying speed to the slower drying timber species. For example, at Scottish Wood we are careful to kiln dry oak separately on its own, but relaxed in mixing other species together in the kiln. 4. Moisture gradient is the moisture content at the centre of the board versus the moisture content on the surface of the board. If this difference, or gradient, is 10% or more, then the timber will be under severe stress, leading to cracking and distortion or even case hardening. Case hardening happens when the wood is being dried too quickly and the cell walls in the outer parts of the board collapse and restrict the movement of water from the centre to the outside. So this is another plus for good air drying, because if you air dry to say 20% moisture content and then kiln dry down to 10 or 12%, whatever you do, you will not reach those dangerous levels of moisture gradient and your wood will be safe. But it is much more of a risk if you kiln dry your wood from, say, 35% moisture content down to 10%. In this case, the process would have to be more carefully controlled. And 5. Fungi will readily colonize your wet timber full of lovely sugary sap. And although these initial colonizers don't damage the structure of the timber, they do cause staining. Sometimes this is decorative, for example the spalted beech or birch, but usually staining is undesirable, especially grey staining in sycamore or maple. To avoid or reduce this, you must get the sawn timber stacked and into stick with the air flowing over those boards as soon as possible. This will be enough for most species, but to avoid grey staining with sycamore or maple, you have to go further. Only cut up logs that have come from trees felled in November through to January, when their sap content is low. Then, once sawn into boards, stack these in a way that the air can move around the board, but without the use of stickers. This is usually done by stacking the boards on end against a wall. Keep them like this until the surface of the boards feel dry, and only then can you put them into stick in the usual way, and this will avoid unsightly sticker stain you will otherwise get when drying sycamore. Now that we have looked at air drying followed by the kiln drying of timber, let's take a look at how best to store it once it's out of the kiln. Ideally, you would store it in a nice, centrally heated building with the same relative humidity as the inside of a house or other building. But this isn't practical for most of us. And so at Scottish Wood, we do the following. First, once out of the kiln, we take the wood out of stick to stop the air moving through the stack and allowing our nicely dried timber to suck up moisture again. Let's go back to that crisp. Now it's been left sitting on the kitchen side overnight. It's going to absorb moisture from the atmosphere. It's going to lose its crispness and dryness and become soft and yuck. It's just the same with kiln-dried wood, and so restricting damp air is the key. So get it out of stick and under cover. Then, many ashes members store their kiln-dried timber in airtight shipping containers. This is effective, and at Scottish Wood we also use stores that are lined with plastic. Behind the wood-lined ceiling, floor and walls, there is a plastic layer. And timber stored in these ways will on the whole stay dry, but may pick up a percentage point or two if left there for a number of months. Another way is to wrap your newly dried stack of timber in cling film. This is good if storing in open-fronted barns, for example, and handy for handling with forklifts. It's a good system when storing in bulk, but it's not very handy if you need access to those packs from time to time for just a few boards, and you must cut the cling film to get them out. So a quick recap. First, the benefits of air drying. It's low cost, it's gentle on the wood. Air-dried timber is quick to finish in the kiln, which means you can get a much higher volume of timber passed through your kiln than if you are kilning wood from wet or from only partially air-dried timber. And this goes on to mean you can carry less kiln-dried stock with all its storage challenges. Because if you run low in one of your kiln-dried stocks, it can quickly be replaced by kilning from your well air-dried stocks. But there are costs to air drying. You need the capital and the space to have a lot of timber quietly air drying away. And this is magnified if you supply a lot of different species to your customers and different thicknesses also of all of these different species. And for kiln drying, keep checking that moisture content of the timber in the kiln. Remember the moisture gradient and slow down the drying process if it's approaching anywhere near that 10%. Stack your pallets in the kiln with stickers and bearers as vertical above each other as possible. And dry oak on its own. And finally, we haven't mentioned softwood, because many Ashes members also work with some softwood species, most commonly larch and Douglas fir. Most of these same rules apply with softwoods, except that most softwood species give up their moisture content more readily than hardwoods, and so drying times are less. Also, the seasoning of softwoods, air and kiln drying, is generally much more forgiving than with hardwoods. Air drying larch and Douglas fir is important when these are to be machined into profile cladding boards, and this is partly to reduce movement and shrinkage once these profiled boards are on the wall, but also because the moulding machines that shape these boards run more effectively and efficiently when the timber is dry. And then at Scottish Wood, we kiln dry our sappy larch boards. These are the boards taken from the outside of a larch log that contain the sapwood. And as sapwood is non-durable, it can't be used in our untreated and naturally durable exterior grade heartwood larch. However, once it is kiln dried, it can still go on to be used internally in a building as furniture or flooring or panelling and so on. Well, I hope you found that useful. Ashes have other short films you might find interesting on things like larch cladding and how to put it up, how to lay a larch deck, a film entirely on Scottish sycamore and Scottish oak, and there are others. We also have guides on how to value, how to source, how to cut up hardwoods, how to machine them, season them, kiln them, and so on, even how to market and sell them, and on how to build a solar kiln, if that's your interest. And finally, we run a 3-day course. We do this once or twice a year on the growing and silviculture involved in hardwoods, and on the processing and valuing and grading of these. It's a 3-day course. It's called Working with Scotland, and for the next dates and more details about that course, have a look at our website. Thank you.